Hey everybody, welcome back to Beyond Profit, a Global Perspective. I'm Mark, and today I want to talk about what business people think about when they consider going to different parts of the world, different regions, and so on. A lot of times students don't know where to start. Maybe you've got a favorite place and it's like, hey, I want to go put a business in Jamaica, or I want to put a business, wherever it is in the world because I like that country. Well, obviously, I think you should be a little bit more systematic about that. And part of that systematic process really begins with an understanding of the kind of factors that you're going to have to think about, right? It's not just, I like this country, therefore I want to go there. It has to be more like, what things are happening in that country that might make it advantageous or not advantageous for me to do that. Now, how do we do that without going into the specific countries? How do I make this generalizable enough for us all to sort of like understand where to even start looking? And that's what that video is going to be about. Now, I do have some other videos that breaks it down a little bit more specifically and systematically. So if you're already past this stage and you already know here are a bunch of factors that I should take into account, you can check out some of my other videos and look at how do I measure that? How do I get the information to figure that out, right? And again, a little more on the specific systematic side. But if you're on the very front end of trying to figure out where to take a business, then you'll find this discussion hopefully pretty helpful. So most of this video comes from a class that I taught recently on the subject. So the first 12 or so minutes really is kind of an open discussion where I'm asking the students to come up with things that they think would be important factors to consider when you're thinking about going to another country. You get to see my commentary and you get to see the sorts of things that we think are important. And then we look at that a little bit more theoretically, so to speak, right? There's two approaches, two models that I think are helpful to maybe think about this, right? One, you're looking at a cost risk benefit approach. The other one is really looking at competitive advantage and Porter's diamond, and are there certain elements, certain factors that exist inside a country that make it particularly partial to being successful in certain industries. So we're going to talk about those things. So let's get started. If you think you're getting a lot of value out of these videos, please like them, share them, subscribe to this channel. And now let's talk a little bit about those factors that might affect where we might put our business. How do you select a country? What factors, or a region for that matter, what factors should you consider when you are doing that? Okay, politics. Why is politics an important consideration, do you think, when you're thinking about export strategies, or maybe not just export, but business entry strategies? You may have an easier time if there's alliances, agreements, not a lot of nasty stuff said between the two countries. Do you want to invest in Venezuela, for example? Okay, I mean, you have Maduro, the president, and whoever that president is going to be there, like I said, Maduro, it's probably going to affect how easily you can do business there, whether you can do business there, whether or not they are going to seize your assets. And who's in power might affect those sorts of your economic prospects. Values. Okay, so why is values important? You may want to go to a place where those values are consistent with your organization. If you have particularly a mission statement or a corporate social responsibility statement that says, we value diversity, or we value these good environmental principles, we're going to do no harm or whatever, right? Then we don't want to go to a place where we might be in a position where that happens. I think that's true. Do businesses go there anyway? Sometimes, yeah. There's a lot of businesses that will not, values is not a factor at all for some, right? But that also might depend on your branding a little bit too, right? It's one thing, there's values, is what you really care about, but that also, like if you make a deliberately bad decision, not only is it maybe a violation of your values, but it might also make your customers mad. Because let's say Patagonia, for example, which is known to be like a very sort of, earth-friendly sort of thing. What would happen if people found out that Patagonia was like doing some really shady production stuff in some sketchy countries and producing stuff that like caused human rights and pollution and all sorts of issues, right? You think people still be buying Patagonia? No. So I mean that's the thing. Like it's not always just what's right, but it's also that it may be aligned with your mission. To violate that mission may be toxic to your brand. Okay, what else?
Culture.
Culture. Okay. So why does culture matter? Assuming that there are differences in culture, then what might make you more likely or less likely to go into that country, or what considerations might you have regarding culture? What might you do about that? If you're going to a place where there are going to be cultural challenges in terms of the perception of a product, then you are going to have to think a little bit differently about how you're going to sell that thing, right? Did you know that like McDonald's is huge in India? Not joking. Okay, so at one point, McDonald's made the decision that they wanted to enter the Indian market, knowing fully well that the cow is sacred there. Like cows just roam around the street. You're not allowed to kill them and all sorts of stuff like that, right? So how is it that a company that sells cows on bread is going to be able to make this work in India? So what do you think they did? They entered anyway, and they are successful. What do you do? Yes, they changed the menu. You don't sell cows on bread, right? You do something else instead. So first of all, in India, there's a lot of lots of vegetarians. So emphasizing more salad, meat options being not cow. Okay, I mean they eat all sorts of other stuff too, other kinds of meats. That's okay. So yes, it required a fundamental change in their menu in order to try to make that work. There's other things that they did as well in terms of local sourcing, like they wouldn't be allowed in the country if they didn't source some of their foods through local Indian farmers. And so we'll talk about that more at a later date. But the point is that yeah, you actually can go into some places where it seems like it's a fundamental difference in culture, but you really have to be ready to address that and deal with that and figure that out. It could have been an epic fail, right? It could have been like, I don't care about your salads and I don't care about your pork burgers or something because you kill cows, so get out of my country, right? Even if you're not selling it to me on bread, but no, dude, like the Indians were very forgiving and McDonald's is huge there, so it worked. And when it comes to culture, it isn't just the presentation of the product that might make a big difference too. In what other ways might culture be challenging? When you're hiring people, right, they're your employees, and they have certain cultural practices and ways of going about doing things, you probably want to be pretty sure about what those practices are, or you might be making people mad or having expectations for people where those expectations aren't very appropriate. You know, you've got to know what you're getting, and you've got to be willing and able to adapt. And so, yeah, culture is another major issue that you got to think about when you go into a country. If I go to your country and I can't speak your language, that's going to be kind of a problem, right? So how do you think we address that? You may have to get translators. You know, where you get that translator may be an interesting question too, right? Do you bring somebody with you who can speak the language, like if you're going to China or something, somebody who speaks Mandarin? Or do you want to get somebody who's already in China who speaks Mandarin, right? Does so fluently. Maybe they speak English fluently, right? So we're going to talk about the advantages and risks of those sorts of approaches toward working with people. But the really hard part of it all is, and I'm speaking as somebody who really, I've been to a lot of countries in the world, a lot of places where they don't speak English. You know, I can speak smatterings of certain languages on demand when I need to, a little bit, right? But it's not nearly as cool as if I was really fluent at it, like if I was really good at it, because it's hard, unless you actually grew up in that environment and you're really fluent in the language, then there's a lot of subtleties that you just don't pick up on, and it's really, really hard to figure that out. And so you've got to assume every place you go has its own subtleties. I mean, even places where they speak English, they've got cultural subtleties that you don't always pick up on either. So multiply that times I can't really speak the language very well, and that can make matters really hard. So I'm not saying don't go to a place where you're not a native speaker, but you do have to think strategically about how you address that question. The economy might matter on a bunch of different levels. At the level you're talking about is the product, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens if you try to sell a product in a country and they can't afford it? You probably better do your research and make sure that doesn't happen. That's a definite consideration. In what other ways do you think economics might matter? Exchange rates, absolutely. depending on the value of that currency, that might affect whether or not you want to invest or not invest. Like if the value of that currency is super high over there, and it's going to take you a lot more dollars to buy property, pay for labor, and you name it, it may not be viable for you to do it. But if the US dollar goes a long way in that place, that may be an incentive for you to want to go in and invest it. It's like, I'm going to buy stuff up cheap. And, this is the other side of it, right? Is, I mentioned property, but also labor, right? If the economy, say the cost of living is relatively lower there and the US dollar is relatively stronger, then that may mean that you're going to be able to take advantage of some cheap labor. And so that might be good in certain aspects, in terms of manufacturing. If you're doing something like a restaurant, then you got to make sure that your product and your labor both follow that. All those things follow that. Property values, the whole thing. So that's one reason why, like, expanding a service business like a restaurant to another country is a really complex kind of a thing to do. But people do it, I'm not saying you shouldn't. The other thing I like that you say here is also the whole question of GDP, right? We're looking at macroeconomic performance. So is this country prone to growth over a period of time, or is this a losing battle, right? You look at the big indicators sometimes in order to try to figure this out, and those are helpful. It's good to look at that stuff sometimes. What other things might you be thinking about? Okay, we'll say sustainability. I like that. Why does sustainability matter? Why are we thinking about this? It's like, maybe I want to go to a place where they're not exploiting the environment and not polluting. Or maybe I want to go to a place where they're exploiting the environment and polluting because it's cheaper and I can skip regulations. And I'm not saying this is a good thing to do, but I'm saying businesses do that stuff, right? We know they do that. Now, I don't think you should do that. This is me saying, no, bad, don't do that. But, but they do. And so it's a consideration, but it's not a consideration that some businesses take seriously. Maybe they ought to take this stuff a little more seriously, kind of like the values question. Any other things you can think of? These are great. So we're going to call it resources and supply chain, right? You got to figure out where your stuff is, where it's coming from. Okay, like I just gave you the example of McDonald's sourcing from local Indian farmers and so on. But not for everything, by the way, because McDonald's has a massive supply chain. I mean, I could give you the statistics. If you look at the list, it's like all those little ingredients come from different places all over the world, and they're connected in this massive chain, and they deliver here and there, and they somehow make it work. It's super complex, but that's what it is. So you get a restaurant or something, you got to figure out, like, okay, so where am I going to get all that food, and how am I going to get it to me? And that's, that's not an easy thing to deal with. But whatever that is, getting it from one place to another is an important question, right? The whole issue of supply chain, right? Do I need to be close to whatever it is that I need in order to make whatever I want to make, or in order to serve whatever service that I want to do, or export whatever the thing is that I want to do? Like with export, I could just make something here and send it off someplace else, right? I don't have to, my supply chain basically is shipping it. You could also manufacture something in another country, bring it back to the United States, right? It could be an American company, but that's just you're offshoring, you're outsourcing that process and then selling it someplace else. Usually simpler chains make for simpler businesses, okay? But there are advantages of this massive diversification. The reason why McDonald's does it the way they do it is so that they can get some really inexpensive, like, you got to get quality stuff at cheap. Walmart is great at that too. And so figuring out how you're going to get all that together, and that becomes a question of price versus complexity, right? You're going for low prices, but you're willing to deal with a lot of stuff from a lot of different places in order to make that happen. Anything else you all can think of? This is a great list. All right, well, we can call that good for now then. So one way to think about this is a cost-benefit risk model, okay? And I think if you look at all that stuff up there, you're dealing with exactly that, right? How much is something going to cost me, or what costs am I incurring in the process of doing something, versus what are the benefits, and what are possible risks of my going and doing that. Benefits, costs, and risks. So let's look at each one in turn. We'll start out by looking at benefits, right? The benefits of doing business in a country are a function of, one thing is the market size. I guess that's something that we didn't really talk about as much in the in our list up there. But yeah, I mean, I suppose GDP, that may be one function of a market size. But when you're looking at a product, you're trying to figure out like, okay, is there really an opportunity for me to do something here, right? That's where you get into questions of market saturation. Like, if my business isn't there so far, the kind of business that I do is not there so far, why is that? Is it because there's too many other people already doing that kind of thing? Or is it that they can't afford it, that maybe there's not enough money, there's not enough of a market there to make that happen, right? So market size becomes a good question. The purchasing power of its consumers, right? Can people afford the thing that you're going to sell them, assuming that you're bringing the product to that particular country? And their likely future wealth, okay? So that may require some future, some crystal ball, futuristic sort of stuff, some stuff that is sometimes very hard to figure out. If you're able to do it early, like let's say that you're looking at the country and they're not doing your business, and the answer is, actually, there's a great opportunity here because there is a demand and nobody's here doing it. And if you're a first mover, I mean, you can capture market, you can hopefully command brand loyalty. I mean, there's all sorts of opportunities for you to get in there and capture that market. And chances are, if you're doing well, then other competitors are going to come in afterwards, and then you got to deal with that. But just, there's such an advantage to being a first mover if you're able to do something like that, right? But the other thing is just, again, trying to read the tea leaves, trying to figure this out. Like, take South Korea, I think, is a great example of this, okay? In 1960, it was an impoverished, developing state. Today, it's the 15th largest economy in the world, as measured by GDP. And so firms looked at this country and said, hey, I think there's something here. They looked probably at cost of labor, education. That's another thing we don't really have up here on the list, but that's another thing that's important, right? Do you have people that are actually equipped to do the things that you want them to do? Do they have the proper level of education? Or do you need education at all, right? But that's still a factor, right? So people are looking at South Korea and they're thinking, hey, there's great benefits in doing this. And people who've invested in South Korea are making loads and loads of money over so much time. So then there's the costs of doing business, right? And this comes to at least a couple of factors that you guys thought were really important in your analysis. So first, the political system, right? There's all sorts of politics things that we've already talked about, but here's one, right? Is it necessary to pay bribes in order to get market access? Is it corrupt? Who am I going to have to pay off? And, there are facilitating payments that are legal in the international system, but there's U.S. law and international law that's largely against certain forms of corruption. And so if you think that's something you have to deal with, you may not want to go there, right? That's maybe the cost is too high. Economic level, right? Are the necessary supporting business and infrastructure in place, right? If you go in there, and again, if you ask the question, why isn't a business like mine already there? The answer may be that there are other businesses out there that aren't able to support it. Like if I were an automotive manufacturer and I wanted to move it there, so on, right? There may be some things that I want to have locally sourced, or at least in countries that are nearby me in order to cut costs and so on, right? I'm going to be mindful of what I have. Is everything possible there necessary to make it happen? Infrastructure, right? Can I actually, if I'm selling it inside the country, are there roads that allow me to do that, right? Can I get it to the people who actually want it, right? And then the legal system. It may be more costly to do business in countries with dramatically different product, workplace, and pollution standards, many of which you guys mentioned, right? Or where there's poor legal protection for property rights. And again, I use the example of Venezuela. You start up a business in Venezuela, you can say it's yours, but if the government sort of decides they want to take it over, then they're going to take it over, and there'll probably be very little legal recourse, that very little that you could do about it. McDonald's opened in Russia in 1990, okay? The first country that I went in, I actually was in Mexico and Canada briefly, but outside the North American zone, the first country I was ever in was Russia. I went there I know it dates me, but you guys already know how old I am, 1993, and so it was just a couple years after they changed from being the communist Soviet Union to Russia, right? So I'm going over there and checking it out. And I checked out the McDonald's. It was the biggest McDonald's in the world. And you walk into this place and it's like, a typical McDonald's, like nowadays, they got like 2 or 3 registers. It used to be like maybe you'd have 7 or 8 before they got all efficient, but with using apps and stuff like that. But there were probably like 50 registers across the front of it. And it looked like this. People were in line like crazy just to get into a McDonald's. It was absolutely crazy. So it made them loads and loads of money, but they also had to invest a lot of money in order to ensure quality. Russia wasn't quite ready for the quality of operation that McDonald's was ready to do, so they had to put some money in it in order to make that work. It also transformed customer service, right? When I was in Russia, one of the things that I noticed right away was like customer service sucked. It was bad. Like, it was like they were used to being, oh yes, we're in the Soviet Union, and I work for this state-owned thing, and it doesn't matter, I have no motivation to do anything. And so you go in, and it may have been privatized, but it didn't matter. Like, you go into a shop, and you're like, there's nobody there. Like, hey, can I get some help? Go away, it's lunchtime! Like, that's the kind of stuff that you would get. Go away! Really? Just shout and go away. So McDonald's has this sort of high standard in terms of customer service, and it transforms certain industries in terms of the way that they approach that. Now, I will say, and another issue, right, because we're talking about costs, politics, economics, and the legal system, right? Politically speaking, they actually recently moved out. So they're not there anymore now, and some of that has to do with the Ukraine war, some of the divisions between the United States and Russia over that particular issue. And so that became an issue. And they may also have faced legal costs, depending on if the government bore down on them, like if they stayed there, what would the government have done to them? There's also, at least in the 1990s, there was a really strong Russian mafia, and I can talk more about that later on. But, what do you do if you got to pay off a mafia? Like, is that a viable strategy? So these are the kinds of costs that you think about, like when you're going to another country. And then there's risks. That's a function of political, economic, and legal risks, so it's sort of a reflection of the same 3 categories we were talking about before. So political risk, that's the likelihood that political forces are going to cause drastic changes in a country's business environment that adversely affects the profit and other goals of a business enterprise. We've got economic risk. That's the likelihood that economic mismanagement is going to cause drastic changes in the business environment that hurts the profit and other goals. And then legal risk, right? That like a trading partner may opportunistically break a contract or expropriate property rights. We already talked about expropriation of property rights, like what happens if Maduro takes my business from me, right? But the other thing is maybe you've got a legitimate trading partner, like someplace like China, and they don't do it the way you want you to do. They don't do the business the way you want them to do the business, or they do things that undermine you, or drive you away, or suddenly they seize control of it, or something like that. So those are issues of legal risk, particularly in a situation where you may not have legal support in the country where you are operating. So now I want to talk a little bit about competitive advantage, and Porter's diamond is a model that allows us to look at that. Right? What makes the United States great in the chemical industry? Why is Switzerland good at precision instruments and pharmaceuticals? These sorts of factors affect that. And again, these are the kinds of things that might help you when you are selecting what kind of region or what kind of country you may want to move your business into. It identifies 4 attributes primarily that promote or impede the creation of competitive advantage. The first one is called factor endowments. That is a nation's position in factors of production necessary to compete in a given industry. So it could be like basic, like natural resources, climate, or location, or advanced, skilled labor, infrastructure, technological know-how. We're talking about stuff that already exists inside the country. So like if you are rich in rare earth minerals, or you're rich in coal, then it makes sense that that's going to be something that you might specialize in. You have it, so you're going to use it. Like if you're fishing or something like that, you've got a coastline, you've got a great fishing industry, right? Maybe you focus on that. So the factor assumes that there are certain things about your economy that are they're kind of built in. Climate, right? There's some countries that may be able to grow crops really well. We wouldn't do so well with bananas here in the Midwest, right? That's why we don't grow bananas. Climate affects this thing, location affects this thing. And the more advanced things are things like I mentioned before, education, skilled labor, infrastructure, technological know-how, things that are built into the structure of the economy. Then we have demand conditions. That is the nature of home demand for the industry's product or service. In other words, it makes a lot of sense to make something if your people at home want it, right? Because that's the obvious first move. Most people don't think like, wow, I'm going to pick a country and I'm going to start a business way over there. Most of the time it's like, hey, I know these people and there's this service and nobody's doing it, so I'm just going to start doing it, right? So that local demand tends to push what those factors are. Could demand for information technology cause that country to be good at providing it and able to support it, right? In a country where we have awesome technology and people are looking for customer service support and for advanced stuff, right? We're going to continue to make that because it's right here. And we're going to be happy to export it because we've become good at it. Third, we have relating and supporting industries. And we mentioned this before as well, the presence or absence of supplier industries and related industries. So, could a presence of diverse manufacturing businesses help a country to specialize in building cars? One of the reasons why the United States has been so good at auto is that we have a gazillion other businesses that support it. When you make an automobile, right, you've got tires, you've got plastic, you've got the stuff that goes into making the doors, you've got handles, you've got like a million little bits, and a car is a collection of a million little bits. And the car company doesn't make all that stuff, right? The car company sources that stuff, brings it in, and then you assemble it someplace. If you already have some of those businesses present, then it makes sense that you are more easily able to do those things. Granted, nowadays we source a lot of car parts from a lot of different places, but most of them nowadays are from Canada and Mexico, right? And guess what? They're like next door. And then 4, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. So this affects how companies are created, organized, and managed. So some of it may have to do with management ideologies. So if there are lots of business people and they have certain ideas about how to do businesses and they have that in common, that may lead to a national competitive advantage, but also domestic rivalry may cause strength in certain industries. So if you have an industry and there's a lot of tight competition, right, that may drive prices down, it may make you more efficient, it may make you better at doing things, right? And so that structure of that economy, the strategy and the rivalry, all might affect whether or not you're going to want to sell that particular thing. In some areas where maybe it's not as competitive and it's not as low price and so on, maybe that's not going to be the thing we focus on as much. That all makes sense so far? So there's one bonus one that he talks about, and that is government policy. And so government policy can affect demand through product standards. So like if the government suddenly says, okay, here's some regulations that mean that you have to have this product manufactured at this level for the purpose of safety, right? And all of a sudden, that's the way everybody has to do it. And that's going to affect the demand. They can also influence rivalry through regulation and antitrust laws. So if you've got a monopoly and the government doesn't do anything about it, then obviously you're not going to get competitive advantage in terms of efficiency. It's not going to bring your prices down any. You're not going to be as good of a situation as far as that goes. And it may impact the availability of highly educated workers and advanced transportation infrastructure. You think about it like the roads that we build. I mean, who builds them? Who pays for it? Construction companies, right? But who pays for our roads? Taxes, right? So I guess we do, but the government is in charge of funneling that money to make that stuff happen. If you're in a country where they're not willing or don't have the tax base to do that, then that might affect the demand for all sorts of stuff, right? Or let's say that education, you don't have a high demand on education, and you're not willing to spend more, and you're not willing to fund universities and do all this sort of stuff, right? That's also going to affect how much and what kind of products you're going to make in the long run. So the government is also and has an impact on that. So Porter's theory should predict the pattern of international trade we observe in the real world based on the things that different countries are good at. And countries should be exporting products from those industries where all 4 components of the diamond are favorable. So when you're looking at different countries, right, you may want to look at some of these conditions, right? Like what will make it favorable for me to be successful inside that country? So what did we learn? Well, First of all, we learned that the idea of taking a business to another country is a potentially very complex thing. But there are a list of factors that I think would be helpful anyway to take into account as you're just starting to think about it, as you're starting to gather evidence and data and try to weigh that out. Second, considering a cost, benefit, risk approach to those factors is one way of really trying to start comparing and figuring out maybe where you want to go. And finally, I would say consider competitive advantage. Consider those things that countries may have that make them unique, that make them special, that may make them a better candidate for a certain sort of industry or business. So anyway, I hope that you got a lot out of this. Once again, please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you next time.